Men Like Gods by H.G. Wells. Book 2, Chapter 4. The End of Quarantine Crag. Mr. Barnstaple awoke slowly and reluctantly from a dream about cookery. He was Sawyer, the celebrated chef of the Reform Club, and he was inventing and tasting new dishes. But in the pleasant way of dreamland, he was not only Sawyer, but at the same time he was a very clever utopian biologist and also God Almighty, so that he could not only make new dishes, but also make new vegetables and meats to go into them. He was particularly interested in a new sort of fowl, the Chateaubriand breed of fowls, which was to combine the rich quality of a very good beefsteak with the size and delicacy of a fowl's breast, and he wanted to stuff it with a blend of pimento, onion, and mushroom, except that the mushroom wasn't quite the thing. The mushrooms, he tasted them, indeed, just the least little modification, and into the dream came an assistant cook, several assistant cooks, all naked as utopians, bearing fowls from the pantry and saying that they had not kept, they had gone high, and that they were going higher. In order to illustrate this idea of their going higher, these assistant cooks lifted the fowls above their heads and then began to climb the walls of the kitchen, which were rocky and for a kitchen remarkably close together. Their figures became dark. They were thrown up in black outline against the luminous steam arising from a cauldron of boiling soup. It was boiling soup, and yet it was cold soup and cold steam. Mr. Barnstaple was awake. In the place of luminous steam there was mist, brightly moonlit mist, filling the gorge. It threw up the figures of the two utopians in black silhouette. What utopians? His mind struggled between dreaming and waking. He started up rigidly attentive. They moved with easy gestures, quite unaware of his presence, so close to them. They had already got a thin rope ladder fixed to some point overhead, but how they had managed to do this he did not know. One still stood on the shelf, the other swayed above him, stretched across the gully, clinging to the rope with his feet against the rock. The head of a third figure appeared above the edge of the shelf. It swayed from side to side. He was evidently coming up by a second rope ladder. Some sort of discussion was in progress. It was borne in upon Mr. Barnstaple that this last comer thought that he and his companions had clambered high enough, but that the uppermost man insisted they should go higher. In a few moments the matter was settled. The uppermost utopian became very active, lunged upward, swung out, and vanished by jerks out of Mr. Barnstaple's field of view. His companions followed him, and one after the other was lost to sight, leaving nothing visible but the convulsively agitated rope ladder and a dangling rope that they seemed to be dragging up the crag with them. Mr. Barnstaple's taut muscles relaxed. He yawned silently, stretched his painful limbs, and stood up very cautiously. He peered up the gully. The utopians seemed to have reached the shelf above and to be busy there. The rope that had dangled became taut. They were hauling up something from below. It was a large bundle, possibly of tools or weapons or material wrapped in something that deadened its impact against the rock. It jumped into view, hung spinning for a moment, and was then snatched upward as the utopians took in a fresh reef of rope. A period of silence followed. He heard a metallic clang and then thud, thud, a dull intermittent hammering. Then he jumped back as the end of a thin rope, apparently running over a pulley, dropped past him. The sounds from above now were like filing, and then some bits of rock fell past him into the void. He did not know what to do. He was afraid to call to these utopians and make his presence known to them. After the murder of Serpentine, he was very doubtful how a utopian would behave to an earthling found hiding in a dark corner. He examined the rope ladder that had brought these utopians to his level. It was held by a long spike, the end of which was buried in the rock at the side of the gully. Possibly the spike had been fired at the rock from below while he was asleep. The ladder was made up of straight links and rings at intervals of perhaps 2 feet. It was of such light material that he would have doubted its capacity to bear a man if he had not seen the utopians upon it. It occurred to him that he might descend by this now and take his chances with any utopians who might be below. He could not very well bring himself to the attention of these 3 utopians above except by some sudden and startling action which might provoke sudden and unpleasant responses. But if he appeared first clambering slowly from above, any utopians beneath would have time to realize and consider the fact of his proximity before they dealt with him. And also, he was excessively eager to get down from this dreary ledge. He gripped a ring, thrust a leg backwards over the edge of the shelf, listened for some moments to the little noises of the three workers above him, and then began his descent. It was an enormous descent. Presently he found himself regretting that he had not begun counting the rings of the ladder. He must already have handed himself down hundreds. And still, when he craned his neck to look down, the dark gulf yawned below. It had become very dark now. The moonlight did not cut down very deeply into the canyon, and the faint reflection from the thin mist above was all there was to break the blackness. And even overhead, the moonlight seemed to be passing. Now he was near the rock. Now it fell away, and the rope ladder seemed to fall plumb into lightless, bottomless space. He had to feel for each ring, and his bare feet and hands were already chafed and painful, and a new and disagreeable idea had come into his head, that some utopian might presently come rushing up the ladder. But he would get notice of that because the rope would tighten and quiver, and he would be able to cry out, "I am an earthling coming down. I am a harmless earthling." He began to cry out these words experimentally. The gorge re-echoed them, and there was no answering sound. He became silent again, descending grimly and as steadily as possible, because now an intense desire to get off this infernal rope ladder and rest his hot hands and feet was overmastering every other motive. Clang, clang, and a flash of green light. He became rigid, peering into the depths of the canyon. Came the green flash again. It revealed the depths of the gorge, still as it seemed an immense distance below him. And up the gorge, something. He could not grasp what it was during that momentary revelation. At first he thought it was a huge serpent writhing its way down the gorge, and then he concluded it must be a big cable that was being brought along the gorge by a handful of utopians. But how the 3 or 4 figures he had indistinctly seen could move this colossal rope, he could not imagine. The head of this cable serpent seemed to be lifting itself obliquely up the cliff. Perhaps it was being dragged up by ropes he had not observed. He waited for a third flash, but none came. He listened. He could hear nothing but a throbbing sound he had already noted before, like the throbbing of an engine running very smoothly. He resumed his descent. When at last he reached a standing place, it took him by surprise. The rope ladder fell past it for some yards and ended. He was swaying more and more and beginning to realize that the rope ladder came to an end when he perceived the dim indication of a nearly horizontal gallery cut along the rock face. He put out a foot and felt an edge and swung away out from it. He was now so weary and exhausted that for a time he could not relinquish his grip on the rope ladder and get a footing on the shelf. At last he perceived how this could be done. He released his feet and gave himself a push away from the rock with them. He swung back into a convenient position for getting a foothold. He repeated this twice, and then had enough confidence to abandon his ladder and drop onto the shelf. The ladder dangled away from him into the darkness, and then came wriggling back to tap him playfully and startlingly on the shoulder blade. The gallery he found himself in seemed to follow a great vein of crystalline material along the cliff face. Borings as high as a man ran into the rock. He peered and felt his way along the gallery for a time. Manifestly, if this was a mine, there would be some way of ascending to it and descending from it into the gorge. The sound of the torrent was much louder now, and he judged he had perhaps come down 2/3 of the height of the crag. He was inclined to wait for daylight. The illuminated dial of his wristwatch told him it was now 4 o'clock. It would not be long before dawn. He found a comfortable face of rock for his back and squatted down. Dawn seemed to come very quickly, but in reality he dozed away the interval. When he glanced at his watch again, it was 5:30. He went to the edge of the gallery and peered up the gorge to where he had seen the cable. Things were pale and dim and very black and white, but perfectly clear. The walls of the canyon seemed to go up forever and vanish at last in cloud. He had a glimpse of a utopian below, who was presently hidden by the curve of the gorge. He guessed that the great cable must have been brought so close up to the quarantine crag as to be invisible to him. He could find no down-going steps from the gallery, but some 30 or 40 yards off were 5 or 6 cableways running at a steep angle from the gallery to the opposite side of the gorge. They looked very black and distinct. He went along to them. Each was a carrier cable, on which ran a PM all carrier trolley with a big hook below. 3 of the carrier cables were empty, but on 2 the trolley was hauled up. Mr. Barnstaple examined the trolleys and found a catch, retained them. He turned over one of these catches and the trolley ran away promptly, nearly dropping him into the gulf. He saved himself by clutching the carrier cable. He watched the trolley swoop down like a bird to the broad stretch of sandy beach on the other side of the torrent and come to rest there. It seemed all right. Trembling violently, he turned to the remaining trolley. His nerves and will were so exhausted now that it was a long time before he could bring himself to trust to the hook of the remaining trolley and to release its catch. Then smoothly and swiftly he swept across the gorge to the beach below. There were big heaps of crystal and mineral on this beach, and a cable, evidently for raising it, came down out of the mist above from some invisible crane, but not a utopian was in sight. He relinquished his hold and dropped safely on his feet. The beach broadened downstream, and he walked along it close to the edge of the torrent. The light grew stronger as he went. The world ceased to be a world of grays and blacks. Color came back to things. Everything was heavily bedewed, and he was hungry and almost intolerably weary. The sand changed in its nature and became soft and heavy for his feet. He felt he could walk no further. He must wait for help. He sat down on a rock and looked upward towards Quarantine Crag, towering overhead. Sheer and high, the great headland rose like the prow of some gigantic ship behind the 2 deep blue canyons. A few wisps and layers of mist still hid from Mr. Barnstaple its crest and the little bridge across the narrower gorge. The sky above, between the streaks of mist, was, now, an intense blue, and even as he gazed, the mist swirled and dissolved. The rays of the rising sun smote the old castle to blinding gold, and the fastness of the earthling stood out clear and bright. The bridge and the castle were very remote, and all that part of the crag was like a little cap on the figure of a tall, upstanding soldier. Round beneath the level of the bridge, at about the height at which the 3 utopians had worked, or were still working, ran something dark, a rope-like band. He jumped to the conclusion that this must be the cable he had seen lit up by those green flashes in the night. Then he noted a peculiar body upon the crest of the more open of the 2 gorges. It was an enormous vertical coil, a coil flattened into a disc, which had appeared on the edge of the cliff opposite to the Coronation Crag. Less plainly seen because of a projecting mass of rock was a similar coil in the narrower canyon close to the steps that led up from the little bridge. 2 or 3 utopians, looking very small because they were so high and very squat because they were so foreshortened, were moving along the cliff edge and handling something that apparently had to do with these coils. Mr. Barnstaple stared at these arrangements with much the same uncomprehending stare as that with which some savage who had never heard a shot fired in anger might watch the loading of a gun. Came a familiar sound, faint and little. It was the hooter of Quarantine Castle sounding the reveille, and almost simultaneously the little Napoleonic figure of Mr. Rupert Catskill emerged against the blue. The head and shoulders of Finck rose and halted and stood at attention behind him. The captain of the Earthlings produced his field glasses and surveyed the coils through them. "I wonder what he makes of them," said Mr. Barnstaple. Mr. Catskill turned and gave some direction to Pink, who saluted and vanished. A click from the nearer gorge jerked his attention back to the little bridge. It had gone. His eye dropped and caught it up within a few yards of the water. He saw the water splash and the metal framework crumple up and dance 2 steps and lie still, and then a moment later the crash and clatter of the fall reached his ears. "Now who did that?" asked Mr. Barnstaple, and Mr. Catskill answered his question by going hastily to that corner of the castle and staring down. Manifestly he was surprised. Manifestly, therefore, it was the utopians who had cut the bridge. Mr. Catskill was joined almost immediately by Mr. Hunker and Lord Barrelonga. Their gestures suggested an animated discussion. The sunlight was creeping by imperceptible degrees down the front of Quarantine Crag. It had now got down to the cable that encircled the crest. In the light this shone with a coppery sheen. The 3 utopians who had awakened Mr. Barnstaple in the night became visible descending the rope ladder very rapidly, and once more Mr. Barnstaple was aware of that humming sound he had heard ever and again during the night. But now it was much louder, and it sounded everywhere about him, in the air, in the water, in the rocks, and in his bones. Abruptly something black and spear-shaped appeared beside the little group of earthlings above. It seemed to jump up beside them. It paused and jumped again half the height of a man, and jumped again. It was a flag being hauled up a flagstaff that Mr. Barnstaple had not hitherto observed. It reached the top of the staff and hung limp. Then some eddy in the air caught it. It flapped out for a moment, displayed a white star on a blue ground, and dropped again. This was the flag of Earth. This was the flag of the crusade to restore the blessings of competition, conflict, and warfare to utopia. Beneath it appeared the head of Mr. Burleigh, examining the utopian coils through his glasses. The throbbing and humming in Mr. Barnstaple's ears grew rapidly louder and rose acutely to an extreme intensity. Suddenly, great flashes of violet light leapt across from coil to coil, passing through Quarantine Castle as though it was not there. For a moment longer it was there. The flag flared out madly and was torn from its staff. Mr. Burleigh lost his hat. A half length of Mr. Catskill became visible, struggling with his coat tails, which had blown up and enveloped his head. At the same time, Mr. Barnstaple saw the castle rotating upon the lower part of the crag, exactly as though some invisible giant had seized the upper tenth of the headland and was twisting it round. And then it vanished. As it did so, a great column of dust poured up into its place. The waters in the gorge sprung into the air in tall fountains and were splashed to spray, and a deafening thud smote Mr. Barnstaple's ears. Aerial powers picked him up and tossed him a dozen yards, and he fell amidst a rain of dust and stones and water. He was bruised and stunned. "My God!" he cried. "My God!" and struggled to his knees, feeling violently sick. He had a glimpse of the crest of Quarantine Crag, truncated as neatly as though it had been cheese cut with a sharp knife. And then fatigue and exhaustion had their way with him, and he sprawled forward and lay insensible. End of Book 2, Chapter 4. Chapter 1. The Peaceful Hills Beside the River. God has made more universes than there are pages in all the libraries of earth. Man may learn and grow forever amidst the multitude of his worlds. Mr. Barnstaple had a sense of floating from star to star and from plane to plane through an incessant variety and wonder of existences. He passed over the edge of being. He drifted for ages down the faces of immeasurable cliffs. He traveled from everlasting to everlasting in a stream of innumerable little stars. At last came a phase of profound restfulness. There was a sky of level clouds, warmed by the light of a declining sun, and a skyline of gently undulating hills, golden grassy upon their crests, and carrying dark purple woods and thickets and patches of pale yellow like ripening corn upon their billowing slopes. Here and there were dome buildings and terraces, flowering gardens and little villas, and great tanks of gleaming water. There were many trees like the eucalyptus, only that they had darker leaves, upon the slopes immediately below and round and about him, and all the land fell at last towards a very broad valley, down which a shining river wound leisurely in great semicircular bends until it became invisible in the evening haze. A slight movement turned his eyes to discover Lichness seated beside him. She smiled at him and put her finger on her lips. He had a vague desire to address her, and smiled faintly and moved his head. She got up and slipped away from him past the head of his couch. He was too feeble and incurious to raise his head and look to see where she had gone, but he saw that she had been sitting at a white table on which was a silver bowl full of intensely blue flowers, and the color of the flowers held him and diverted his first faint impulse of curiosity. He wondered whether colors were really brighter in this utopian world, or whether something in the air quickened and clarified his apprehension. Beyond the table were the white pillars of the loggia. A branch of one of these eucalyptus-like trees, with leaves bronze black, came very close outside. And there was music. It was a little trickle of sound that dripped and ran, a mere unobtrusive rivulet of little clear notes upon the margin of his consciousness, the song of some fairyland Debussy. Peace. He was awake again. He tried hard to remember. He had been knocked over and stunned in some manner too big and violent for his mind to hold as yet. Then people had stood about him and talked about him. He remembered their feet. He must have been lying on his face with his face very close to the ground. Then they had turned him over, and the light of the rising sun had been blinding in his eyes. Two gentle goddesses had given him some restorative in a gorge at the foot of high cliffs. He had been carried in a woman's arms as a child is carried. After that there were cloudy and dissolving memories of a long journey, a long flight through the air. There was something next to this, a vision of huge complicated machinery that did not join on to anything else. For a time his mind held this up in an interrogative fashion, and then dropped it wearily. There had been voices in consultation, the prick of an injection and some gas that he had had to inhale, and sleep, or sleeps, spells of sleep interspersed with dreams. Now with regard to that gorge, how had he got there? The gorge, in another light, a greenish light, with utopians who struggled with a great cable. Suddenly hard and clear came the vision of the headland of Coronation Crag, towering up against the bright blue morning sky, and then the crest of its grinding round, with its fluttering flags and its disheveled figures, passing slowly and steadily, as some great ship passes out of a dock, with its flags and passengers, into the invisible and unknown. All the wonder of his great adventure returned to Mr. Barnstaple's mind. He sat up in a state of interrogation, and Lichness reappeared at his elbow. She seated herself on his bed close to him, shook up some pillows behind him, and persuaded him to lie back upon them. She conveyed to him that he was cured of some illness and no longer infectious, but that he was still very weak. Of what illness? He asked himself. More of the immediate past became clear to him. There was an epidemic, he said, a sort of mixed epidemic of all our infections. She smiled reassuringly. It was over. The science and organization of utopia had taken the danger by the throat and banished it. Lichness, however, had nothing to do with the preventive and cleansing work that had ended the career of these invading microbes so speedily. Her work had been the help and care of the sick. Something came through to the intelligence of Mr. Barnstaple that made him think that she was faintly sorry that this work of pity was no longer necessary. He looked up into her beautiful, kindly eyes and met her affectionate solicitude. She was not sorry Utopia was cured again. That was incredible. But it seemed to him that she was sorry that she could no longer spend herself in help, and that she was glad that he at least was still in need of assistance. "What became of those people on the rock?" he asked. "What became of the other earthlings?" She did not know. They had been cast out of Utopia, she thought. Back to Earth? She did not think they had gone back to Earth. They had perhaps gone into yet another universe, but she did not know. She was one of those who had no mathematical aptitudes, and physical chemical science and the complex theories of dimensions that interested so many people in Utopia were outside her circle of ideas. She believed that the crest of Coronation Crag had been swung out of the utopian universe altogether. A great number of people were now intensely interested in this experimental work upon the unexplored dimensions into which physical processes might be swung, but these matters terrified her. Her mind recoiled from them as one recoils from the edge of a cliff. She did not want to think where the earthlings had gone, what deeps they had reeled over, what immensities they had seen and swept down into. Such thoughts opened dark gulfs beneath her feet where she had thought everything fixed and secure. She was a conservative in Utopia. She loved life as it was and as it had been. She had given herself to the care of Mr. Barnstaple when she had found that he had escaped the fate of the other earthlings, and she had not troubled very greatly about the particulars of that fate. She had avoided thinking about it. But where are they? Where have they gone? She did not know. She conveyed to him haltingly and imperfectly her own halting and unsympathetic ideas of these new discoveries that had inflamed the utopian imagination. The crucial moment had been the experiment of Arden and Green Lake that had brought the earthlings into Utopia. That had been the first rupture of the hitherto invincible barriers that had held their universe in 3 spatial dimensions. That had opened these abysses. That had been the moment of release for all the new work that now filled Utopia. That had been the first achievement of practical results from an intricate network of theory and deduction. It sent Mr. Barnstaple's mind back to the humbler discoveries of Earth, to Franklin snapping the captive lightning from his kite, and Galvani with his dancing frog's legs, puzzling over the miracle that brought electricity into the service of men. But it had taken a century and a half for electricity to make any sensible changes in human life because the earthly workers were so few and the ways of the world so obstructive and slow and spiteful. In Utopia, to make a novel discovery was to light an intellectual conflagration. Hundreds of thousands of experimentalists in free and open cooperation were now working along the fruitful lines that Arden and Green Lake had made manifest. Every day, every hour now, new and hitherto fantastic possibilities of interspatial relationship were being made plain to the Utopians. Mr. Barnstaple rubbed his head and eyes with both hands and then lay back, blinking at the great valley below him, growing slowly golden as the sun sank. He felt himself to be the most secure and stable of beings at the very center of a sphere of glowing serenity, and that effect of an immense tranquility was a delusion. That still evening peace was woven of incredible billions of hurrying and clashing atoms. All the peace and fixity that man has ever known or will ever know is but the smoothness of the face of a torrent that flies along with incredible speed from cataract to cataract. Time was when men could talk of everlasting hills. Today a schoolboy knows that they dissolve under the frost and wind and rain and pour seaward, day by day and hour by hour. Time was when men could speak of terra firma and feel the earth fixed, adamantine beneath their feet. Now they know that it whirls through space, eddying about a spinning, blindly driven sun amidst a sheep-like drift of stars. And this fair curtain of appearance before the eyes of Mr. Barnstaple, this still and level flush of sunset, and the great cloth of starry space that hung behind the blue, that too was now to be pierced and torn and rent asunder. The extended fingers of his mind closed on the things that concerned him most. "But where are my people?" he asked. "Where are their bodies? Is it just possible they are still alive?" She could not tell him. He lay thinking. It was natural that he should be given into the charge of a rather backward-minded woman. The active-minded here had no more use for him in their lives than active-minded people on Earth have for pet animals. She did not want to think about these spatial relations at all. The subject was too difficult for her. She was one of Utopia's educational failures. She sat beside him with the divine sweetness and tranquility upon her face, and he felt his own judgment upon her like a committed treachery. Yet he wanted to know very badly the answer to his question. He supposed the crest of Coronation Crag had been twisted round and flung off into some outer space. It was unlikely that this time the Earthlings would strike a convenient planet again. In all probability they had been turned off into the void, into the interstellar space of some unknown universe. What would happen then? They would freeze. The air would instantly diffuse right out of them. Their own gravitation would flatten them out, crush them together, collapse them. At least they would have no time to suffer. A gasp, like someone flung into ice-cold water. He contemplated these possibilities. "Flung out," he said aloud, "like a cage full of mice thrown over the side of a ship." "I don't understand," said Lichtness, turning to him. He appealed to her. "And now, tell me, what is to become of me?" For a time Lichtness gave him no answer. She sat with her soft eyes upon the blue haze into which the great river valley had now dissolved. Then she turned to him with a question. "You want to stay in this world?" "Surely any Earthling would want to stay in this world. My body has been purified. Why should I not stay?" "It seems a good world to you?" "Loveliness, order, health, energy, and wonder. It has all the good things for which my world groans and travails." "And yet our world is not content." "I could be contented." "You are tired and weak still." "In this air I could grow strong and vigorous. I could almost grow young in this world. In years, as you count them here, I am still a young man." Again she was silent for a time. The mighty lap of the landscape was now filled with indistinguishable blue, and beyond the black silhouettes of the trees upon the hillside, only the skyline of the hills was visible against the yellow-green and pale yellow of the evening sky. Never had Mr. Barnstaple seen so peaceful a nightfall. But her words denied that peace. "Here," she said, "there is no rest. Every day men and women awake and say, 'What new thing shall we do today? What shall we change?' They have changed a wild planet of disease and disorder into the sphere of beauty and safety. They have made the wilderness of human motives bear union and knowledge and power. And research never rests, and curiosity and the desire for more power and still more power consumes all our world. A healthy appetite. I am tired now, as weak and weary and soft as though I had just been born. But presently, when I have grown stronger, I too may share in that curiosity and take a part in these great discoveries that now set Utopia astir. Who knows?" He smiled at her kind eyes. "You will have much to learn," she said. She seemed to measure her own failure as she said these words. Some sense of the profound differences that 3,000 years of progress might have made in the fundamental ideas and ways of thinking of the race dawned upon Mr. Barnstaple's mind. He remembered that in Utopia he heard only the things he could understand, and that all that found no place in his terrestrial circle of ideas was inaudible to his mind. The gulfs of misunderstanding might be wider and deeper than he was assuming. A totally illiterate Gold Coast Negro, trying to master thermoelectricity, would have set himself a far more hopeful task. "After all, it is not the new discoveries that I want to share," he said. "Quite possibly they are altogether beyond me. It is this perfect, beautiful, daily life, this life of all the dreams of my own time come true, that I want. I just want to be alive here. That will be enough for me." "You are weak and tired yet," said Lichtness. When you are stronger, you may face other ideas. But what other ideas? Your mind may turn back to your own world and your own life. Go back to Earth? Lichness looked at the twilight again for a while before she turned to him with, You are an earthling born and made. What else can you be? What else can I be? Mr. Barnstaple's mind rested upon that, and he lay feeling, rather than thinking, amidst its implications, as the pinpoint lights of utopia pricked the darkling blue below, and ran into chains and groups and coalesced into nebulous patches. He resisted the truth below her words. This glorious world of utopia, perfect and assured, poised, ready for tremendous adventures amidst untraveled universes, was a world of sweet giants and uncompanionable beauty, a world of enterprises in which a poor, muddy-witted, weak-willed earthling might neither help nor share. They had plundered their planet as one empties a purse. They thrust out their power amidst the stars. They were kind. They were very kind. But they were different. End of Book 3, Chapter 1.
Book 3, Chapter 2 The Loiterer in a Living World. Section 1. In a few days Mr. Barnstaple had recovered strength of body and mind. He no longer lay in bed in a loggia filled with self-pity and the beauty of a world subdued. He went about freely and was soon walking long distances over the utopian countryside, seeking acquaintances and learning more and more of this wonderland of accomplished human desires. For that is how it most impressed him. Nearly all the greater evils of human life have been conquered. War, pestilence, and malaise, famine, and poverty had been swept out of human experience. The dreams of artists of perfected and lovely bodies, and of a world transfigured to harmony and beauty, had been realized. The spirits of order and organization ruled triumphant. Every aspect of human life had been changed by these achievements. The climate of this valley of rest was bland and sunny like the climate of South Europe, but nearly everything characteristic of the Italian or Spanish scene had gone. Here were no bent and aged crones carrying burthens, no chattering pursuit by beggars, no ragged workers lowering by the wayside. The puny terracing, the distressing accumulations of hand cultivation, the gnarled olives, hacked vines, the little patches of grain or fruit, and the grudged litigious irrigation of those primitive conditions gave place to sweeping schemes of conservation, to a broad and subtle handling of slope and toil and sunshine. No meagre goats nor sheep, child tended, cropped among the stones, no tethered cattle, ate their apportioned circles of herbage and no more. There were no hovels by the wayside, no shrines with tortured, blood-oozing images, no slinking, misbegotten curs, nor beaten beasts, sweating and panting between their overloaded panniers at the steeper places of rutted, rock-strewn and dung-strewn roads. Instead, the great, smooth, indestructible way swept in easy gradients through the land, leaping gorges and crossing valleys upon wide-arched viaducts, piercing cathedral-like aisles through the hillsides, throwing off bastions to command some special splendor of the land. Here were resting places and shelters, stairways clambering to pleasant arbors, and summer houses where friends might talk and lovers shelter and rejoice. Here were groves and avenues of such trees as he had never seen before. For on earth as yet there is scarcely such a thing as an altogether lovely, healthy, fully grown tree. Nearly all our trees are bored and consumed by parasites, rotten and tumorous with fungi, more gnarled and crippled and disease-twisted even than mankind. The landscape had absorbed the patient design of 25 centuries. In one place Mr. Barnstaple found great works in progress, a bridge being replaced, not because it was outworn, but because someone had produced a bolder, more delightful design. For a time he had not observed the absence of telephonic or telegraphic communication. The posts and wires that marked a modern countryside had disappeared. The reasons for that difference he was to learn later, nor did he at first missed the railway station and the wayside inn, he perceived that the frequent buildings must have specific functions, that people came and went from them with an appearance of interest and preoccupation, that from some of them seemed to come a hum and whir of activity. Work of many sorts was certainly in progress, but his ideas of the mechanical organization of this new world were too vague and tentative as yet for him to attempt to fix any significance to this sort of place or that. He walked agape like a savage in a garden. He never came to nor saw any towns. The reason for any such close accumulations of human beings had largely disappeared. In certain places, he learnt, there were gatherings of people for studies, mutual stimulation, or other convenient exchanges, in great series of communicating buildings, but he never visited any of these centres. And about this world went the tall people of Utopia, fair and wonderful, smiling or making some friendly gesture as they passed him, but giving him little chance for questions or intercourse. They travelled swiftly in machines upon the high road or walked, and ever and again the shadow of a silent, soaring aeroplane would pass over him. He went a little in awe of these people, and felt himself a queer creature when he met their eyes, for, like the gods of Greece and Rome, theirs was a cleaned and perfected humanity, and it seemed to him that they were gods. Even the great tame beasts that walked freely about this world had a certain divinity that checked the expression of Mr. Barnstaple's friendliness. Section 2. Presently he found a companion for his rambles, a boy of 13, a cousin of Lucian's, named Crystal. He was a curly-headed youngster, brown-eyed as she was, and he was reading history in a holiday stage of its education. So far as Mr. Barnstaple could gather, the more serious part of his intellectual training was a mathematical work, interrelated to physical and chemical science, but all that was beyond the earthling's range of ideas. Much of this work seemed to be done in cooperation with other boys, and could be what we should call research on earth. Nor could Mr. Barnstaple master the nature of some other sort of study which seemed to turn upon refinements of expression, but the history brought them together. The boy was just learning about the growth of the utopian social system out of the efforts and experiences of the ages of confusion. His imagination was alive with the tragic struggles upon which the present order of utopia was founded. He had 100 questions for Mr. Barnstaple, and he was full of explicit information which was designed presently to sink down and become part of the foundations of his adult mind. Mr. Barnstaple was as good as a book to him, and he was as good as a guide to Mr. Barnstaple. They went about together talking upon a footing of the completest equality, this rather exceptionally intelligent earthling and this utopian stripling, who topped him by perhaps an inch when they stood side by side. The boy had the broad facts of utopian history at his fingers' ends. He could explain and find an interest in explaining how artificial and upheld the peace and beauty of utopia still were. The utopians were, in essence, he said, very much what their ancestors had been in the beginnings of the near Stone Age, 15,000 or 20,000 years ago. They were still very much what earthlings had been in the corresponding period. Since then there had been only 600 or 700 generations, and no time for any very fundamental changes in the race. There had not been even a general admixture of races. On Utopia, as on Earth, there had been dusky and brown peoples, and they remained distinct. The various races mingled socially, but did not interbreed very much. Rather, they purified and intensified their racial gifts and beauties. There was often very passionate love between people of contrasted race, but rarely did such love come to procreation. There had been a certain deliberate elimination of ugly, malignant, narrow, stupid, and gloomy types during the past dozen centuries or so, but except for the fuller realization of his latent possibilities, the common man in Utopia was very little different from the ordinary, energetic, and able people of a later Stone Age or early Bronze Age community. They were infinitely better nourished, trained, and educated, and mentally and physically their condition was clean and fit, but they were the same flesh and nature as we are. "But," said Mr. Barnstaple, and struggled with that idea for a time, "do you mean to tell me that half the babies born on earth today might grow to be such gods as these people I meet? Given our air, given our atmosphere, given your heritage, given our freedom?" In the past of Utopia, in the age of confusion, Mr. Barnstaple had to remember, everyone had grown up with a crippled or a thwarted will, hampered by vain restrictions or misled by plausible delusions. Utopia still bore it in mind that human nature was fundamentally animal and savage and had to be adapted to social needs, but Utopia had learnt the better methods of adaptation, after endless failures of compulsion, cruelty, and deception. On earth we tame our animals with hot irons and our fellow men by violence and fraud, said Mr. Barnstaple, and described the schools and books, newspapers and public discussions of the early 20th century to his incredulous companion. You cannot imagine how beaten and fearful even decent people are upon earth. You learn of the age of confusion in your histories, but you do not know what the realities of a bad mental atmosphere, an atmosphere of feeble laws, hates, and superstitions are. As night goes round the earth, always, there are hundreds of thousands of people who should be sleeping, lying awake, fearing a bully, fearing a cruel competition, dreading lest they cannot make good, ill of some illness they cannot comprehend, distressed by some irrational quarrel, maddened by some thwarted instinct or some suppressed and perverted desire. Cristel admitted that it was hard to think now of the age of confusion in terms of misery. Much of the everyday misery of earth was now inconceivable. Very slowly Utopia had evolved its present harmony of law and custom in education. Man was no longer crippled and compelled. It was recognized that he was fundamentally an animal, and that his daily life must follow the round of appetites satisfied and instincts released. The daily texture of Utopian life was woven of various and interesting foods and drinks, of free and entertaining exercise and work, of sweet sleep, and of the interest and happiness of fearless and spiteless love making. Inhibition was at a minimum, but where the power of Utopian education began was after the animal had been satisfied and disposed of. The jewel on the reptile's head that had brought Utopia out of the confusions of human life was curiosity. The play impulse, prolonged and expanded in adult life into an insatiable appetite for knowledge and an habitual creative urgency. All Utopians had become, as little children, learners and makers. It was strange to hear this boy speaking so plainly and clearly of the educational process to which he was being subjected, and particularly to find he could talk so frankly of love. An earthly bashfulness almost prevented Mr. Barnstaple from asking, "But you do not make love?" "I have had curiosity," said the boy, evidently saying what he had been taught to say. "But it is not necessary or becoming to make love too early in life, nor to let desire take hold of one. It weakens youth to become too early possessed by desire, which often will not leave one again. It spoils and cripples the imagination. I want to do good work as my father has done before me." Mr. Barnstaple glanced at the beautiful young profile at his side, and was suddenly troubled by memories of a certain study number 4 at school, and of some ugly phases of his adolescence. The stuffy secret room, the hot and ugly fact. He felt a beastlier earthling than ever. "Hey ho!" he sighed. "But this world of yours is as clean as starlight, and as sweet as cold water on a dusty day." "Many people I love," said the boy, "but not with passion. Some day that will come, but one must not be too eager and anxious to meet passionate love, or one might make believe or give or snatch at a sham. There is no hurry. No one will prevent me when my time comes. All good things come to one in this world in their own time, but work one does not wait for. One's work, since it concerns one's own self only, one goes to meet." Cristel thought very much about the work that he might do. It seemed to Mr. Barnstaple that work, in the sense of uncongenial toil, had almost disappeared from Utopia. Yet all Utopia was working. Everyone was doing work that fitted natural aptitudes and appealed to the imagination of the worker. Everyone worked happily and eagerly, as those people we call geniuses do on our earth. For suddenly Mr. Barnstaple found himself telling Cristel of the happiness of the true artist, of the true scientific worker, of the original man, even on earth as it is today. They too, like the Utopians, do work that concerns themselves and is in their own nature for great ends. Of all earthlings they are the most enviable. "If such men are not happy on earth," said Mr. Barnstaple, "it is because they are touched with vulgarity, and still heed the soiled successes and honours and satisfactions of vulgar men, still feel neglect and limitation that should concern them no more. But to him Who has seen the sun shine in Utopia? Surely the utmost honour and glory of earth can signify no more and be no more desirable than the complimentary spittle of the chieftain and a string of barbaric beads. Section 3. Cristel was still of an age to be proud of his savoir-faire. He showed Mr. Barnstaple his books and told him of his tutors and exercises. Utopia still made use of printed books. The books were still the simplest, clearest way of bringing statement before a tranquil mind. Cristel's books were very beautifully bound in flexible leather that his mother had tooled for him very prettily, and they were made of hand-made paper. The letter was some fluent phonetic script that Mr. Barnstaple could not understand. It reminded him of Arabic, and frequent sketches, outline maps, and diagrams were interpolated. Cristel was advised in his holiday reading by a tutor for whom he prepared a sort of exercise report, and he supplemented his reading by visits to museums, but there was no educational museum convenient in the Valley of Peace for Mr. Barnstaple to visit. Cristel had passed out of the opening stage of education, which was carried on, he said, upon large educational estates given up wholly to the lives of children. Education up to 11 or 12 seemed to be much more carefully watched and guarded and taken care of in Utopia than upon earth. Shocks to the imagination, fear and evil suggestions were warded off as carefully as were infection and physical disaster. By 8 or 9 the foundations of a utopian character were surely laid: habits of cleanliness, truth, candour and helpfulness, confidence in the world, fearlessness and a sense of belonging to the great purpose of the race. Only after 9 or 10 did the child go outside the garden of its early growth and begin to see the ordinary ways of the world. Until that age the care of the children was largely in the hands of nurses and teachers, but after that time the parents became more of a factor than they had been in a youngster's life. It was always a custom for the parents of a child to be near and to see that child in its nursery days. But just when earthly parents tended to separate from their children as they went away to school or went into business, utopian parentage grew to be something closer. There was an idea in Utopia that between parent and child there was a necessary temperamental sympathy. Children looked forward to the friendship and company of their parents, and parents looked forward to the interest of their children's adolescence. And though a parent had practically no power over a son or daughter, he or she took naturally the position of advocate, adviser, and sympathetic friend. The friendship was all the franker and closer because of that lack of power, and all the easier because age for age the Utopians were so much younger and fresher minded than earthlings. Cristel, it seemed, had a very great passion for his mother. He was very proud of his father, who was a wonderful painter and designer, but it was his mother who possessed the boy's heart. On his second walk with Mr. Barnstaple he said he was going to hear from his brother, and Mr. Barnstaple was shown the equivalent of correspondence in Utopia. Cristel carried a little bundle of wires and light rods, and presently coming to a place where a pillar stood in the midst of a lawn, he spread this affair out like a long cat's cradle, and tapped a little stud in the pillar with a key that he carried on a light gold chain about his neck. Then he took up a receiver attached to his apparatus, and spoke aloud and listened, and presently heard a voice. It was a very pleasant woman's voice. It talked to Cristel for a time without interruption, and then Cristel talked back, and afterwards there were other voices, some of which Cristel answered and some of which he heard without replying. Then he gathered up his apparatus again. This, Mr. Barnstaple learnt, was the Utopian equivalent of letter and telephone, for in Utopia, except by previous arrangement, people do not talk together on the telephone. A message is sent to the station of the district in which the recipient is known to be, and there it waits until he chooses to tap his accumulated messages, and any that one wishes to repeat can be repeated. Then he talks back to the senders and dispatches any other messages he wishes. The transmission is wireless. The little pillars supply electric power for transmission or for any other purpose the Utopians require. For example, the gardeners resort to them to run their mowers and diggers and rakes and rollers. Far away across the valley, Cristel pointed out the district station at which this correspondence gathered and was dispersed. Only a few people were on duty there. Almost all the connections were automatic. The messages came and went from any part of the planet. This set Mr. Barnstaple going upon a long string of questions. He discovered for the first time that the message organisation of Utopia had a complete knowledge of the whereabouts of every soul upon the planet. It had a record of every living person, and it knew in what message district he was. Everyone was indexed and noted. To Mr. Barnstaple, accustomed to the crudities and dishonesties of earthly governments, this was an almost terrifying discovery. On earth that would be the means of unending blackmail and tyranny, he said. Everyone would lie open to espionage. He had a fellow at Scotland Yard. If he had been in your communication department he would have made life in Utopia intolerable in a week. You cannot imagine the nuisance he was. Mr. Barnstaple had to explain to Cristel what blackmail meant. It was like that in Utopia, to begin with, Cristel said. Just as on earth, so in Utopia, there was the same natural disposition to use knowledge and power to the disadvantage of one's fellows, and the same jealousy of having one's personal facts known. In the Stone Age in Utopia, men kept their true names secret and could only be spoken of by nicknames. They feared magic abuses. "Some savages still do that on earth," said Mr. Barnstaple. "It was only very slowly that Utopians came to trust doctors and dentists, and only very slowly that doctors and dentists became trustworthy. It was a matter of scores of centuries before the chief abuses of the confidences and trusts necessary to a modern social organization could be effectively corrected. Every young Utopian had to learn the 5 principles of liberty, without which civilization is impossible. The first was the principle of privacy. This is that all individual personal facts are private between the citizen and the public organization to which he entrusts them, and can be used only for his convenience and with his sanction. Of course, all such facts are available for statistical uses, but not as individual personal facts. And the second principle is the principle of free movement. A citizen, subject to the due discharge of his public obligations, may go without permission or explanation to any part of the Utopian planet. All the means of transport are freely at his service. Every Utopian may change his surroundings, his climate, and his social atmosphere as he will. The third principle is the principle of unlimited knowledge. All that is known in Utopia, except individual personal facts about living people, is on record and as easily available as a perfected series of indices, libraries, museums, and inquiry offices can make it. Whatever the Utopian desires to know, he may know with the utmost clearness, exactness, and facility, so far as his powers of knowing and his industry go. Nothing is kept from him, and nothing is misrepresented to him. And that brought Mr. Barnstaple to the fourth principle of liberty, which was that lying is the blackest crime. Cristel's definition of lying was a sweeping one: the inexact statement of facts, given the suppression of a material fact, was lying. Where there are lies there cannot be freedom. Mr. Barnstaple was mightily taken by this idea. It seemed at once quite fresh to him, and one that he had always unconsciously entertained. Half the difference between Utopia and our world, he asserted, lay in this, that our atmosphere was dense and poisonous with lies and shams. "When one comes to think of it," said Mr. Barnstaple, and began to expatiate to Cristel upon all the falsehoods of human life, the fundamental assumptions of earthly associations were still largely lies, false assumptions of necessary and unavoidable differences in flags and nationality, pretenses of function and power in monarchy, impostures of organized learning, religious and moral dogmas and shams. And one must live in it. One is a part of it. You are restrained, taxed, distressed, and killed by these insane unrealities. Lying is the primary crime. How simple is that? How true and necessary is that? That dogma is the fundamental distinction of the scientific world state from all preceding states. And going on from that, Mr. Barnstaple launched out into a long and loud tirade against the suppression and falsifications of earthly newspapers. It was a question very near his heart. The London newspapers had ceased to be impartial vehicles of news. They omitted, they mutilated, they misstated. They were no better than propaganda rags. Nature, within its field, was shiningly accurate and full, but that was a purely scientific paper. It did not touch the everyday news. The press, he held, was the only possible salt of contemporary life, and if the salt had lost its savour, the poor man found himself orating as though he was back at his Sydenham breakfast table after a bad morning's paper. "Once upon a time Utopia was in just such a tangle," said Crystal consolingly. "But there is a proverb: Truth comes back where once she has visited. You need not trouble so much as you do. Some day even your press may grow clear." "How do you manage about newspapers and criticism?" said Mr. Barnstaple. Crystal explained that there was a complete distinction between news and discussion in Utopia. There were houses, one was in sight, which were used as reading rooms. One went to these places to learn the news. Thither went the reports of all the things that were happening on the planet, things found, things discovered, things done. The reports were made as they were needed. There were no advertisement contracts to demand the same bulk of news every day. For some time Crystal said the reports had been very full and amusing about the Earthlings, but he had not been reading the paper for many days because of the interest in history the Earthling affair had aroused in him. There was always news of fresh scientific discoveries that stirred the imagination. One frequent item of public interest and excitement was the laying out of some wide scheme of research. The new spatial work that Arden and Greenlake had died for was producing much news. And when people died in Utopia, it was the custom to tell the story of their lives. Crystal promised to take Mr. Barnstaple to a new place and entertain him by reading him some of the utopian descriptions of earthly life which had been derived from the Earthlings, and Mr. Barnstaple asked that when this was done he might also hear about Arden and Greenlake, who had been not only great discoverers but great lovers, and of Serpentine and Cedar, for whom he had conceived an intense admiration. Utopian news lacked, of course, the high spice of an earthly newspaper, the intriguing murders and amusing misbehaviours, the entertaining and exciting consequences of sexual ignorance and sexual blunderings, the libel cases and detected swindles, the great processional movements of royalty across the general traffic, and the romantic fluctuations of the stock exchange and sport. But where the news of Utopia lacked liveliness, the liveliness of discussion made up for it. For the fifth principle of liberty in Utopia was free discussion and criticism. Any Utopian was free to criticize and discuss anything in the whole universe provided he told no lies about it directly or indirectly. He could be as respectful or disrespectful as he pleased. He could propose anything, however subversive. He could break into poetry or fiction as he chose. He could express himself in any literary form he liked, or by sketch or caricature as the mood took him. One only must refrain from lying. That was the one rigid rule of controversy. He could get what he had to say, print it, and distribute it to the newsrooms. There it was read or neglected as the visitors chanced to approve of it or not. Often, if they liked what they read, they would carry off a copy with them. Crystal had some new fantastic fiction about the exploration of space among his books, imaginative stories that boys were reading very eagerly. There were pamphlets of 30 or 40 pages printed on a beautiful paper that he said was made directly from flax and certain reeds. The librarians noted what books and papers were read and taken away, and these they replaced with fresh copies. The piles that went unread were presently reduced to 1 or 2 copies, and the rest went back to the pulping mills. But many of the poets and philosophers and storytellers whose imaginations found no wide popularity were nevertheless treasured, and their memories kept alive by a few devoted admirers. "I am not at all clear in my mind about one thing," said Mr. Barnstaple. "I have seen no coins and nothing like money passing in this world. By all outward appearance this might be a communism such as was figured in a book we used to value on earth, a book called News from Nowhere, by an Earthling named William Morris. It was a graceful and possible book. In that dream everyone worked for the joy of working and took what he needed. But I have never believed in communism because I recognize, as here in Utopia you seem to recognize, the natural fierceness and greediness of the untutored man. There is joy in creation for others to use, but no natural joy in unrequited service. The sense of justice to himself is greater in man than the sense of service. Somehow here you must balance the work anyone does for Utopia against what he destroys or consumes. How do you do it?" Crystal considered. There were communists in Utopia in the last stage of confusion. In some parts of our planet they tried to abolish money, suddenly and violently, and brought about great economic confusion and want and misery. To step straight to communism failed very tragically. And yet utopia today is practically a communism, and except by way of curiosity I have never had a coin in my hand all my life. In utopia, just as upon earth, he explained, money came as a great discovery, as a method of freedom. Hitherto, before the invention of money, all service between man and man had been done through bondage or barter. Life was a thing of slavery and narrow choice. But money opened up the possibility of giving a worker a free choice in his reward. It took utopia 3,000 years and more to realize that possibility. The idea of money abounded in pitfalls and was easily corruptible. Utopia floundered its way to economic lucidity through long centuries of credit and debt, false and debased money, extravagant usury, and every possibility of speculative abuse. In the matter of money, more than any other human concern, human cunning has set itself most vilely and treacherously to prey upon human necessity. Utopia once carried, as earth carries now, a load of parasitic souls, speculators, forestallers, gamblers, and bargain-pressing shylocks, exacting every conceivable advantage out of the weakness of the monetary system. She had needed centuries of economic sanitation. It was only when Utopia had got to the beginnings of worldwide political unity, and when there were sufficiently full statistics of world resources and world production, that human society could at last give the individual worker the assurance of a coin of steadfast significance, a coin that would mean for him today or tomorrow or at any time the certainty of a set quantity of elemental values. And with peace throughout the planet and increasing social stability, interest, which is the measure of danger and uncertainty, dwindled at last to nothing. Banking became a public service perforce, because it no longer offered profit to the individual banker. Rentier classes, Crystal conveyed, are not a permanent element in any community. They mark a phase of transition between a period of insecurity and high interest and a period of complete security and no interest. They are a dawn phenomenon. Mr. Barnstaple digested this statement after an interval of incredulity. He satisfied himself by a few questions that young Utopia really had some idea of: what a rentier class was, what its moral and imaginative limitations were likely to be, and the role it may have played in the intellectual development of the world by providing a class of independent minds. "Life is intolerant of all independent classes," said Crystal, evidently repeating an axiom. "Either you must earn or you must rob. We have got rid of robbing." The youngster, still speaking by his book, went on to explain how the gradual disuse of money came about. It was an outcome of the general progressive organization of the economic system, the substitution of collective enterprises and of wholesale for retail dealing. There had been a time in Utopia when money changed hands at each little transaction and service. One paid money if one wanted a newspaper or a match or a bundle of flowers or a ride on a street conveyance. Everybody went about the world with pockets full of small coins, paying on every slight occasion. Then, as economic science became more stable and exact, the methods of the club and the covering subscription extended. People were able to buy passes that carried them by all the available means of transport for a year or for 10 years or for life. The state learnt from clubs and hotels to provide matches, newspapers, stationery and transport for a fixed annual charge. The same inclusive system spread from small and incidental things to great and essential matters, to housing and food and even clothing. The state postal system, which knew where every Utopian citizen was presently able to conjunction with the public banking system to guarantee his credit in any part of the world. People ceased to draw coin for their work. The various departments of service and of economic, educational, and scientific activity would credit the individual with his earnings in the public bank, and debit him with his customary charges for all the normal services of life. "Something of this sort is going on earth even now," said Mr. Barnstaple. "We use money in the last resort, but a vast volume of our business is already a matter of bookkeeping. Centuries of unity and energy have given Utopia a very complete control of many foundations of natural energy upon the planet, and this was the heritage of every child born therein. He was credited at his birth with a sum sufficient to educate and maintain him up to 4 or 5 and 20, and then he was expected to choose some occupation to replenish his account." "But if he doesn't," said Mr. Barnstaple, "everyone does." "But if he didn't, he'd be miserable and uncomfortable. I've never heard such a case. I suppose he'd be discussed. Psychologists might examine him. But one must do something." But suppose Utopia had no work for him to do? Crystal could not imagine that. There was always something to be done. But in Utopia once, in the old times, you had unemployment. That was part of the confusion. There was a sort of hypertrophy of debt. It had become paralysis. Why, when they had unemployment at that same time, there was neither enough houses, nor food, nor clothing. They had unemployment and shortage at one and the same time. It is incredible. Does anyone